welcome everybody in what is, I must say, a hard-working day here at this conference, session after session. Immediately back from lunch. I have not been here up until now, Sir John Scarlett, and I'm chairing, as a Senior Associate Fellow of RUSI, I'm chairing this session, which is the opportunity to focus on Israel's security concerns and to articulate them, to discuss them. That's the point of this particular session. The title, if you like, the sort of headline, could instability be encouraged on Israel's borders, recreating Gaza problems on the West Bank? Well, that says some of it, but I think we'll find that the definition of security concerns goes beyond that. And it's a valuable opportunity to hear and consider them on the basis of presentations from four well-qualified speakers. Now, I've been asked, I'm not quite sure whether all these things have already been said several times already, but I've been asked to make certain points clear at the beginning. Of course, as everybody knows, in accordance with the RUSI rule, speakers' presentations that we're about to hear are on the record. But any comments that come up and are made in the question and answer session are completely off the record. Personally, I've always been very keen on off the record, so I'll be policing that rather carefully, not for reporting, of course, unless you have the explicit permission both of the speaker and of RUSI itself. Please make sure that mobiles are off. It's important. And please, when it comes to the question and answer session, of course, wait for the microphone to get to you before you start speaking. And another point of policing, I'm sorry, when the questions come, please make sure they're questions and they're not statements. I'm pretty alert to the tendency to go into statements, and I will react firmly on that, so it's a warning now. And of course, questions by definition can be much shorter than statements, so we just get through more issues and subjects if we stick to that. Now, what I'm going to do is ask for my distinguished colleagues on the panel to make their statements and presentations for approximately 10 minutes each. But first, I want to introduce them briefly. You've got the biographies in front of you, but I think it is appropriate just to introduce them and polite myself. Dr. Eran Lerman, who is the Deputy National, Lehan, who is the Deputy National... Lerman. Ignore this. Yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was Lerman. Yeah. Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel since October 2009. He's a former Israeli director of the American Jewish Committee, long service in military intelligence, and active since 2002 on Track 2 meetings and issues and seminars with a range of colleagues from around the region, extensive experience as a lecturer in Israel. And I think actually, so as not to distract everybody with too much detail at this stage, I'll limit myself to that introduction and ask Dr. Lerman to begin, and then I'll introduce other colleagues, but you can see we're going to follow this order here.
Our business this afternoon, and I know there is no British written constitution. In the American Constitution, there is a clause against inhumane and cruel punishment, which I think includes giving lectures after lunch. But having said so, let me see if I can focus our minds not on the immediate question of the aftermath of the Palestinian misadventure at the UN, but rather the larger question of what the security requirements would be for Israel in the context of the emergence of the two-state solution. And here I want to point to a development of Israeli opinion. This is not I'm not making a political statement here. I'm making an observation as to the directions in which the mainstream of Israeli opinion have gone over the last decade or so. Let me make a paradoxical observation here. In one respect, there has been a paradigm shift towards the acceptance of the two-state solution. Very minor. There are people who doubt the applicability of the idea. There are people who seriously question, as you may have heard already, whether it can be achieved. But as an idea, as a principle, as a definition of what the future may hold, this has been fairly broadly accepted by all but very few in the Israeli political spectrum on the far right and far left. At the same time, there's also been a shift towards a much greater emphasis on the security dimension and the expectations of the people from their government to deliver on security. And the reason is quite simple. You have a generation in Israel now, our children, who grew up a decade ago not knowing if they would come off the bus in one piece. That leaves a certain scar, that leaves a certain perspective. And this leads directly to what I would call the primacy of security as we look towards the future. There are the lessons of 2000, or the catastrophic eruption of what is mistakenly referred to as the Second Intifada, which was never really an uprising, but a campaign of violence directed from above. There are the lessons of 2006 that I've already mentioned in the previous panel, and there are the lessons of what has happened in Gaza since our disengagement. And all of these frame the discussion. Now, Dr. Scharf mentioned this morning the fact that the Palestinians do not aspire to be Israel's military equal. This is both true and irrelevant. It's true in the sense that they cannot aspire to match the IDF in armored formations, and it's irrelevant because the mode of action that threatens the lives of Israelis is asymmetrical in nature. And it is this asymmetrical threat in its various manifestations, particularly the rocket, the medium and short-range rocket threat to our civilian population under fire, and the terrorist mode of action, as we've seen it in the early years of the previous decade, that are at the core of the asymmetrical threat that we have to face, side by side with the other end of the spectrum of threats over the long distance from Iran and other potential aggressors. And as we've seen, and as I've mentioned already, the practice of housing, and I use this verb quite specifically, housing huge amounts of weapons in total breach of international law by terrorist organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas in civilian population centers, hiding their command centers under hospitals, as was the case, for example, with Hamas during Operation Cast Lead, etc. All of this, again, frames the discussion and the impotence of the international community to even begin to deal with this challenge, frames the discussion. And so when we look down the road to what may need to be the building blocks of what President Obama has called robust security measures, they need to include a number of very specific things. The question of the Jordan Valley has come up in this discussion. I think the Prime Minister was fairly specific in the US Congress and before that in the Knesset when he said that Israel would need, and I would add, the peace and the stability of any future peace agreement would require a long-term military presence in the Jordan Valley. And I'm asking you to read into this sentence also what isn't in this sentence. Long-term doesn't mean forever. Military doesn't mean civilian. Presence doesn't necessarily mean sovereign. But long-term military presence in the Jordan Valley is the only guarantee that we may have for the foreseeable future that the catastrophic scenario that we saw in Gaza, of the area being inundated by the capacity to fire at our citizens, will not repeat itself in the West Bank to the detriment of both Israelis and Palestinians. We shall need special arrangements in the so-called seam areas around Jerusalem and along our population centers. There has been much debate, I know, about the so-called wall, which is 5% wall and 95% fence. But one thing, again, is mathematical. As I mentioned, this is the opposite of the tragic mathematics of Gaza and Lebanon. The creation of the barrier is precisely the point in which the number of catastrophic casualties on both sides begins to decline steeply, to the point in which we have arrived at. And I will grant you that part of this job was done with the help and coordination and cooperation of the Palestinian authorities acting on their own, for their own very good reasons. But nevertheless, we were going to need for the foreseeable future a complex set of security measures in the seam area between Israel and Israeli population centers and a future Palestinian state. We shall need special measures for early warning. This has been written into practically every attempt at an agreement that we have had so far. Because of Israel's very vulnerable, narrow waist, it's a 1-minute flight by a supersonic jet aircraft across the country. And so our early warning must extend far to the east against all eventualities. Control of airspace, given the geographical nature of Israel, would have to be arranged for in a way which will not preclude what is necessary for future Palestinian sovereignty, but would nevertheless enable Israel to defend itself against all comers, east or west. The same goes for the sea approaches and the manner in which legitimate self-defense measures can be implemented. And again, this carries on the discussion we already had as to the Palmer report findings. And this has already been mentioned here, the need for Israel to have effective measures to prevent the abuse of the electromagnetic spectrum that would prevent our economy and our daily life from taking their course if used or abused by hostile forces within the very narrow geographical confines that we share with the Palestinians. Finally, the idea has been raised again and again, and it was raised this morning by Dr. Shah, that maybe Israel can substitute the presence of an international force for its own security forces, for its own security needs for the in the immediate future. What the long-term relationship between us and the Palestinians may entail is yet to be imagined. But in the immediate and intermediate period ahead of us, we have to understand that the only way to react effectively to the asymmetrical threat that I've described is by a very short link between intelligence and operational capacity, what we call nowadays actionable intelligence. With all due respect to the achievements of the NATO treaty, and I'm not here to denigrate NATO in any way, we seek a closer and closer relationship with the alliance. But with all due respect for their capacity for this cycle of intelligence to action, to actually go through 27 decision makers in Brussels, is one sure way of making the terrorists have their say on the ground. And for us, this is not a viable prospect. And I think actually that the last harrowing 6 months in Libya actually made the point even to those who refused to understand it before. So at the end of the day, for the intermediate future, much will continue to depend on our own capabilities and the close and intimate relationship that has to be maintained between us and Palestinian security forces. I remember a session you mentioned that I was quite involved in Track 2 meetings, and I remember a session in which quite a number of people raised these ideas about an international force. And there were only two of us around the table who basically raised an eyebrow. It was me and my late Palestinian friend Abed Aloun, who died in a terrorist bombing in Jordan a few months later. We understood what others theoretically could not, that it is only the people who know the terrain, who know how to translate intelligence into action against this kind of threat that can actually deliver security for us and for the great majority of Palestinians who want to live a normal life. And this will remain the case for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lerman. Not summarizing here, but what strikes me from those comments is your presentation of Israel's sense of vulnerability, given the situation which exists and the geography and the politics, and of course the red lines that you've set out, the key points that must be somehow protected, clear, but of course not straightforward. The point about actionable intelligence is, for someone like me, of course, particularly interesting one. Now, if I can turn to Colonel, brackets retired, brackets, Richard Kemp, to be our next presenter. Richard Kemp is a former commanding officer of the 1st Battalion Royal Anglian Regiment. He commanded in the early stages of Afghanistan all those British forces who were there at the time in Afghanistan, after which he was promoted into the Cabinet Office to work with me. So that's congratulations on that. And I have to say straight away here, because obviously as a personal contact, extremely distinguished member of the Cabinet Office over a critical period as a principal counter-terrorist advisor and advisor on issues coming from Afghanistan and Iraq. So I'm very pleased to have him here. He's somebody who knows Iraq well. First visited Iraq, I think, in 1991 in a tank, and has been back subsequently on a number of occasions. So, Richard.
Thank you very much. It's a bit of a surprise for me to be here working for John again, not having to start at 5 in the morning or whatever time you used to drag us into the Cabinet Office. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard already, and you're going to hear today from other people with much greater expertise than me about Israel's specific security concerns in relation to the Palestinian statehood declaration. And so I'm going to go very slightly off-piste for the next next 10 or so minutes and speak about 10 minutes, is it? Okay. Right. And speak about a slightly different but related concern. And it represents a challenge to the Israeli government and defence forces that is constant and growing. And it's also one that will be particularly acute if Israel's security situation deteriorates following the likely Palestinian declaration later this month. I'm talking about the second front that is now and increasingly an ever-present factor in every modern-day conflict, the war of words. In the era of 24-hour news, the internet, and expanding social media, this has taken on an importance hitherto unimaginable. It's impacted particularly on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Those who consider the State of Israel to be an illegitimate entity, including, of course, Hamas, Fatah, Hezbollah, Iran, and other regional players, concentrate increasing effort on using every single action by Israel's armed forces as a tool to undermine the country's legitimacy. In many cases, international bodies such as the United Nations Human Rights Council and other human rights organizations have been used as witting or unwitting vehicles in this relentless effort. A central aim in the campaign of delegitimization is to give validity and justification to attacks on Israel by groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah, allowing them to strike at Israel with impunity in the international context, and encouraging the view that any retaliatory or defensive measures by Israel are by definition disproportionate and must be criminalized. The more traction this objective is allowed to gain, the greater the instability between Israel and her neighbours, the less chance of any lasting peace, the more that blood will be shed on all sides in the region. All too often, a level of criticism is applied to Israel that is never applied to any other Western, democratically accountable armed forces. A different standard is quite simply demanded. Let me give you 3 examples. In his report to the UN Human Rights Council on the 2009 Gaza conflict, Judge Goldstone concluded that Israel had been guilty of, and I quote, violations of international human rights and humanitarian law and possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. He later explained that his, quote again, allegations of intentionality by Israel were based on the deaths of and injuries to civilians in situations where our fact-finding mission had no evidence on which to draw any other reasonable conclusion, which in my untrained mind, certainly untrained legal mind, is a somewhat odd approach by a well-respected and highly experienced jurist who might normally be expected to work on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. But not so, apparently, for Israel. Goldstone found that the IDF had, quote, a deliberate policy of disproportionate force aimed not at the enemy, but at supporting infrastructure, at the civilian population. This finding was based in large part on the ratio of civilian to military deaths inflicted by the IDF in Gaza. And Goldstone, in common with groups including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, found that 5 out of every 6 deaths during the conflict were non-combatants, civilians. But in November 2010, Hamas Interior Minister Fatih Hamad contradicted Hamas's previous position, saying that the deaths had been of an altogether different order. Contrary to his much lower previous estimates, he said that Hamas and affiliated militias lost 600 to 700 fighters during the conflict. That means fewer than 1 in 2 of the fatalities during the fighting were non-combatants, a very different picture from the one that Goldstone painted. And of course, every civilian casualty in war is a tragedy. But a study published by the United Nations Secretary General shows that there has been, on average, a 3-to-1 ratio of civilian to military deaths in asymmetric conflicts worldwide. That is the UN's estimate for Afghanistan today, 3-to-1. In Iraq and in Kosovo, the UN estimates a higher ratio, 4 civilians to every combatant. A ratio of under 1 civilian killed for every combatant, Hamas's figure for the Gaza conflict, and also Israel's, undermines the widely held assertion that Israel deliberately and systematically targeted the civilian population. And of course, Judge Goldstone himself, in April this year, also changed his mind. He said, while the investigations published by the Israeli military and recognized in the UN Committee's report have established the validity of some incidents that we investigated in cases involving individual soldiers, they also indicate that civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. Goldstone's retraction on this issue, however, has been largely ignored in the international media. And other members of his panel do not accept it, most notably his military advisor, the retired Colonel Desmond Travis, late of the Irish Army. Colonel Travis was the only former military officer in Goldstone's team and therefore was responsible for the military analysis that provided the basis for condemning Israel for war crimes. In October 2009, Colonel Travis gave us an insight into his thinking in an interview with Harper's Magazine as to why he concluded that Hamas did not use mosques in Gaza to store munitions. Colonel Travis said, if I were a Hamas operative, the last place I'd store munitions would be in a mosque. It's not secure, it's very visible, and will probably be pre-targeted by Israeli surveillance. There are many better places to store munitions. The colonel dismissed as twaddle a subsequent finding by fellow Irishman and former British Army Colonel Tim Collins, who inspected a mosque in Gaza destroyed because it had been a weapons depot, finding that there was evidence of explosives stored in the cellar. I suspect that many other British officers who are today fighting in Afghanistan would also dispute Colonel Travis's assumption about the likelihood of mosques being used for weapons storage. As Judge Goldstone's report was going to press on the 4th of September 2009, a tragic incident that received little international attention was unfolding in Kunduz, Afghanistan. By night, a fuel tanker resupplying a German army base had been hijacked by the Taliban. They had promptly got the vehicle bogged in and, rather than abandon its precious load, corralled local villagers to siphon off the fuel and take it away in buckets, cans and other containers. As this was happening, the German commander called for an airstrike on the tanker by US planes, apparently claiming the forces in his base were in danger. A handful of Taliban were killed, but so were 70 civilians, including 24 children under 18. Now, I don't want to go into detail here about the culpability of the commanders concerned or the role of the fog of war in this incident. I use it only as an example of the kind of terrible action that occurs in conflict, including with democratically accountable armies, but that does not attract the same degree of international condemnation as we would have seen had Israel been involved. As for Operation Cast Lead, so too for the Gaza flotilla incident. Human rights groups, international law experts, politicians and the world's media have stridently proclaimed that the naval blockade of Gaza by Israel is illegal, including, predictably enough, the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission, which made its report in September 2010. If Israel's blockade is illegal, then was the boarding by the Royal Navy of the 500-foot cargo ship Nisha in December 2001 also illegal? The Indian-owned Nisha, sailing from Mauritius and bound to London, was suspected, erroneously as it turned out, of having al-Qaeda terrorist materials on board and was intercepted in international waters. During the provisional IRA campaign in the 70s and 80s, the Royal Navy, the Irish Navy and the French Navy often boarded ships heading towards Ireland and searched them for munitions, at a time when Colonel Gaddafi's Libya was arming the IRA with weapons, missiles and explosives. In 2004, a British-led naval task force made up of ships from France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Germany, New Zealand, Australia and Pakistan blockaded the Gulf of Oman to intercept terrorists and munitions heading for the fight in Iraq. And most recently, NATO has been blockading Gaddafi's Libya, an operation with an identical purpose to the Gaza maritime blockade, a blockade in which, with supreme irony, Turkey has been playing a role, Turkey which has led the condemnation of Israel for its blockade of Gaza. The commission appointed by the UN Secretary-General to investigate the incident, chaired by the former New Zealand Prime Minister Sir Geoffrey Palmer, reported last week, and it found that the Israeli blockade was legal, appropriate, and consistent with international law. It asserted that Israeli use of force was morally justified and confirmed that when Israeli commanders boarded the ship, they faced organised and violent resistance from a group of passengers. The Commission also, however, found that the use of force by Israeli troops once on board the vessel was excessive and unreasonable. Israel's own investigation into the incident, the Turkel Commission, also criticised the IDF action, suggesting that the force boarded the ship unprepared for the violent attack that they sustained. And I think any Western military commander would have serious questions to ask about the intelligence and planning process that preceded the operation, which, together with the malign threat of some of those on board, placed the commandos into a nightmare situation, ultimately leading to 9 dead and many wounded on board. On August the 18th, a multiple terrorist attack launched into Israeli territory from Sinai killed 8 Israelis. Israeli intelligence identified the Gaza-based Popular Resistance Committee as being responsible for the attack and launched airstrikes against the PRC in Rafah, killing 5 of its leaders, including the military commander that the Israelis believed had planned the attack. The Israeli response seems to have provoked greater international outcry than the terrorist attack itself. And this is in stark contrast to Turkey's reaction to an attack by the Kurdish PKK the day before the Sinai attack on the 17th of August that killed 9 Turkish soldiers. Turkey's airstrikes against Kurdish bases in northern Iraq that followed killed around 160 PKK fighters according to Turkish General Staff sources. This action has not been met by any significant international outcry. Of course, the circumstances are different in every case, but these three examples suggest a clear pattern of the effective application of double standards against Israeli military operations as compared to those of other Western democratic states. Of course, there are many more comparisons that could be drawn involving the UK, the US, Turkey and other NATO nations. Not to mention the actions of dictators around the world, which of course bear no comparison with the nations we're speaking about. Yet it is often the representatives of such dictatorships who sit on bodies like the UN Human Rights Council and most vocally allege Israel is guilty of war crimes. The Israeli military is, of course, not beyond criticism. Like military forces everywhere, including our own here in Britain, the IDF has its share of bad soldiers and bad commanders who are incompetent, negligent, who deliberately break the law and who are guilty of human error. Errors that, of course, are amplified in the friction and confusion of lethal combat. And it is quite right that its actions should be scrutinized by international bodies as well as Israel's own democratically accountable national institutions. But to the same extent as the actions of, for example, the British, the American, the German, or Turkish armed forces are scrutinized. Those who accept Israel's right to exist must also accept her right to self-defense. For democratic nations and credible, respected international bodies who support the distortion and manipulation of Israel's military actions by those who wish to use them as a means of delegitimizing the state of Israel emboldens extremists and cause further bloodshed. When their human shield tactics are validated, as they were validated by Judge Goldstone, it serves only to encourage the abuse of civilians as weapons of war by extremists and insurgents. I believe we should bear this in mind, especially if, as is possible, the declaration of Palestinian statehood is followed by increased violence against which Israel will need to defend herself. But we should also be alert to the fact that the so-called war crimes which Israel is unjustly condemned for today, other Western democracies might well be condemned for tomorrow. As human rights organizations with political agendas that go beyond human rights alone seize upon established precedent to try and further tie the hands of our own forces, whose job is already hard enough in countering insurgents that use their own people as human shields and seek to exploit the suffering of their own civilian populations as both tactical and strategic weapons. Thank you.
Richard, thank you very much. A detailed consideration of some aspects of the concept and process of delegitimization, and in particular the concern that double standards are applied across a range or by a range of people, countries and institutions and the international community when making serious judgments about the behavior of Israel and activities of the IDF. A point perhaps to note at the end there, if recognise and accept the right to exist, of course it follows automatically the right to self-defence, point which you were making. Now if I can turn to our third speaker, I'm very pleased indeed to welcome here Brigadier General Yossi Kuperwasser, who for the last 2 years plus has been Director General at Israel's Ministry of Strategic Affairs. Brigadier General Kuperwasser, until 2006, was responsible for preparing Israel's national intelligence assessments and early warning, very serious responsibility. And after that, for a brief time also, he was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution.
Good afternoon. I know the habit of starting with some joke or something like that, but I must say the seriousness of the issue is such that it strikes me the difference between all of us sitting here with our ties and coats and the real situation on the ground, which is so different. And when we speak about security of Israel, we have to understand what kind of threats we're facing. I brought here with me some stick that, I don't know if you can put it, Barak, it will help to make people understand what this is all about. Because we are totally detached from reality here. What is the problem here? Iran spoke in length about all kinds of practical elements of it. But in fact, when we speak about security, it's not only about defense. Defense is only one element of security. There is a strategic and political level of security that we first have to address before we can even imagine security. And the problem we face is, and I think it was mentioned in the morning in some connection, is that our neighbors continue to deny the right of the Jewish people to live in their ancestral homeland, deny the fact that there is a Jewish people, call for the annihilation of the state of Israel, and continue to incite for hatred and to create an atmosphere that encourages violence. That is the problem. As long as this is the case, security should be based on very strong military arrangements that would enable us to prevent those who are incited like that from being able to carry out what they are called to do. And in spite of the fact that we want to put an end to a situation where we rule the Palestinians in a way, we cannot do that as long as this is the case. There's no way of doing it. And as a matter of fact, the real reason for which the Palestinians are trying to go to the UN and choose the unilateral track is because they don't want, and they think that they're also unable, but they definitely don't want, to address the security needs of Israel in the context of negotiations, because they know if they are going to join negotiations, if they are going to sit to the table, one of the first questions that are going to be asked is, are you ready to have an agreement in which there are going to be two states for two peoples, in which you will recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people? And would you be ready to see such an arrangement, such an agreement, as the end of all claims? Palestinians say we are never going to recognize Israel as nation state of the Jewish people, and we are ready to have an agreement that would be the end of the conflict, but the end or the finality of only historical claims. And I was breaking my head trying to understand what are those historical claims that the Palestinians are talking about. And one Palestinian helped me and explained to me that historical claims are all those claims that are about what happened before the conflict began. This is history. So if the Jews have some special connection to the Patriarch's tomb in Hebron, this is history. If the agreement says they're not going to be in Hebron, this is the end of this claim. But those claims that emanate from the conflict itself, like refugees, cannot come to an end in the context of an agreement. Obviously, this is a major threat for the security and for the survivability of the state of Israel. And in order to avoid the need to address these security demands of Israel, the strategic security, not the practical security, although they have some reservations about practical security issues as well. In order to avoid these demands, they prefer to go to the unilateral track. Because what they want is to have a state along the 67 lines with Jerusalem as its capital without giving up the dream of coming back to Haifa, without giving Israel real security, real stability. That is what they're trying to achieve. And because of that, this move that the Palestinians are planning right now is mainly about the security of the state of Israel. That is why we are so concerned with this move. It's an attempt to avoid the need to address Israel's security needs. And many people would say, well, but they do accept it in a way. And the PLO has given us a letter in September 1993 saying that the PLO accepts the right of Israel to live in peace and dignity. But people tend to misunderstand the word game that the Palestinians are playing. There are no Palestinian organization is ready to accept the right of Israel to exist, including Fatah, by the way. In August 2009, in the last 6 Fatah convention, they reaffirmed the Fatah basic documents that include the call for the annihilation of the state of Israel. It's possible? Okay, never mind. There are institutions. The Palestinians make a differentiation between organizations and institutions. The organizations deny Israel's right to exist. The institutions, PLO and the PA, are ready to say that they accept Israel's right to exist. But that is provided that Israel does not have a national identity, does not have a Jewish national identity. That's why Abu Mazen repeatedly says, I will never accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. I will never accept Israel as a Jewish state, or however you put it. And they give 3 reasons which apply directly to our security, in the broader sense of the word, not in the issue of defense. The first reason why they are not ready to accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people is that this would mean that there's not going to be a return of Palestinian refugees to Israel proper. Of course, if the Palestinian refugees are going to come back to Israel, this is going to be a major threat to the survival of the state of Israel. Second reason they say is because this is going to have a negative impact on the life of the Israeli Arabs. In what sense they mean it? In the sense that for them, not for the Israeli Arabs, but for them, the Israeli Arabs are already 1.5 million Arabs living in Israel. They are a basis for residential claims in the future. Actually, this has already started in some quarters in the Arab Israeli leadership. So this is, again, something that has to do with the security of Israel and the ability of Israel to survive as a nation state of the Jewish people. And the third issue they raise is that this would mean that they will have to change their narrative, because their entire narrative is about the fact that Israel's existence is some sort of an injustice. So if they accept Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, means that they have to change their narrative. Yes. For peace to prevail, for security to be, the Palestinians have to reconsider their narrative. As long as they don't, we should continue seeing children like those I wanted to show you, and I'm not sure that it's going to be possible, singing song about the destruction of Israel and the destruction of the West at the same time. That's the kind of security threat we are facing in Israel. They also claim from time to time that it's unfair that we raise this issue with them because we did not raise it with Egypt and Jordan, which is right. But there's one big difference. The Egyptians never wanted to go to Haifa, and the Egyptians don't have 1.5 million people living in Israel. That's same goes for the Jordanians. So, of course, this is a different situation. And the security of Israel is going to be based primarily on the readiness of the Palestinians to accept Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people, and to accept that any agreement would be the end and finality of all claims, not only of historical claims as they put it. On top of that, of course, we will have to address the variety of practical security arrangements that Iran dealt with so eloquently, so I really don't want to go into that again. The issue of the presence, the long-time presence of IDF in the Jordan Valley, electromagnetic spectrum, the ability to give early warning, and to rapidly respond to any threat that might appear. We have to remember in this respect that the answers, the defense answers that we should have to take into account both what's going to happen inside the Palestinian territories and what those threats that might come from outside the Palestinian territories as well. We are living in a very unstable region. And these kind of arrangements should look into the future. And that's why 242 said that Israel needs secured and recognized boundaries. And that's something that we have to see how we can get it. If this idea of going to the UN will continue, I'm afraid we'll end up with another very problematic security threat on our footsteps. A very weak and failing so-called state. We shall deal with that in the next session, but this is a major threat because we saw what happened in Gaza. Rapidly enough, this may become something quite similar. And, because there's going to be frustration, there are a lot of things that the Palestinians are looking for and think that they will manage to achieve are not going to materialize. And this frustration might, in the end of the day, have a backfire on the Palestinian leadership itself, not only in Israel. And we might end up with a weak and maybe also with a Hamas-controlled territory that is a major concern for everybody, I think, definitely for Israel. To sum up, I'd say that stable and durable security can be reached only through an agreement that has to be a product of direct negotiations and that will deal with all the dimensions of the problem and primarily with the recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people by the Palestinians. In such an agreement, Israel may be generous, as was mentioned here, in all other aspects of the agreement that the Palestinians are so concerned with. But first of all, in the context of the agreement, this of course, as you well know, is not a condition, a precondition for negotiations, but it's something that has to be an element of the agreement that will be the product of negotiations. First of all, there got to be the recognition of Israel's right to exist as a nation state of Jewish people for stability to prevail. Thank you.
General Kupavasa, thank you very much for that. That's added a further dimension to what's been said already and, of course, goes to the deepest part of the argument or the discussion and the requirements of Israel for its long-term assurance, the recognition of the right of the state of Israel to exist as the state of the Jewish people and everything that flows from that. And there, of course, we are at the very core of the issue, and it is necessary to have that spelled out for discussion. Now, finally, can I ask Professor Dan Shuftan to conclude the presentations. Director of National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa and senior lecturer at the School of Political Sciences, also a lecturer at the National Defense College, a long and distinguished history as an advisor to senior, indeed very senior and top decision and policy makers in Israel, and also a long and distinguished history of consultancy and briefing of senior US figures from the US Senate, from Congress, and from the executive, and also in Europe. Published extensively on Arab-Israel, inter-Arab politics, and US policy in the Middle East, with those qualifications spelled out.
After so many eloquent and well-informed people speaking about security, I will just add a few comments. And also, I think after two colonels and one general, it's finally time for one reserve corporal to say what he thinks about Israel's security. Let me start by speaking about two families of security considerations that Israel has to take into account. There is, of course, and this was mentioned before, the physical element, first of all, terrorism and also alliances with countries hostile to Israel. And unfortunately, recently we have more and more countries who are hostile to Israel, so the variety of these alliances is widened. This is self-evident and well-known. But let us also remember something on the level of national security that goes beyond military issues. And this is a situation that is a byproduct of the gap that will continue to exist between two very different societies, actually first world and third world societies, with a wide discrepancy, not only in the standard of living, but also in the quality of life. And what you have is a combination of this with the historical grievances of the Palestinians concerning the fact that the Jewish state should not have existed there and should not have been established there in the first place. So what we have is also a danger, and if you ask me, this is far more serious than terrorism, of what I would call creeping return, namely a situation where people come into the state of Israel initially because it's economically better and it's a much, much better quality of life. But when they stay there, they change the demographic nature of Israel. And if you look at the question of the security fence, for instance, it was built in order to prevent terrorism. But if you ask me what its major function is, from my point of view, it is not in the narrow security context, but in the broader national security. This is one comment. The second comment is about the difference between what we're having now in the Gaza Strip and what could happen in the West Bank. And let me say, the difference there is not only quantitative, it is qualitative. First of all, the West Bank is literally in the heart of Israel and very close to the centers where everything in Israel happens. So you can disrupt life in Israel in a very, very major way, but by very simple means. And it doesn't have to be an army, and it doesn't even have to be an organization of major size. It can be individuals or small groups who can, from the West Bank, disrupt life in Israel in a way that everyday life becomes impossible. Now, we've had something similar to that in the beginning of this millennium, where parents would not send two children who study in the same school, they wouldn't send them in the same bus, because if the bus explodes on the way to school, so that they don't lose all their children. The proximity is such, we're speaking about hundreds of yards. The proximity is such that you can completely disrupt life in Israel with very, very simple means. You don't need tanks for it, and you don't need long-range missiles. That's one difference. The second difference between Gaza and the West Bank is that Gaza is small and isolated from Egypt by hundreds of kilometers of desert. The West Bank is adjacent to another country with a Palestinian majority, namely Jordan. And the Palestinians in Jordan and elements of radical Islam in Jordan are very, very radical also vis-à-vis Israel. So having the West Bank as a strategic extension of a much larger entity is a very real danger that we should take very seriously. And the third element is, of course, Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is very different because of the way Jewish and Arab neighborhoods are geographically in Jerusalem. Even assume in the best case where you get some kind of agreement where you repartition Jerusalem, it will be always a port through which you can present Israel with very, very serious security problems. The third point, and here I must say that I'm using a word in the question that was presented to all of us, and I found it very amusing. The question was, could instability be encouraged in the West Bank? And what I would argue is you need very little encouragement when the Palestinians and violence are concerned. Let me start by saying the following. We have a history of 120 years of confrontation. 80 years of this 120 years, from the 1929 riots in Hebron, demonstrate a very systematic approach by the Palestinians, saying, in the final analysis, violence always pays. First of all, because they hope that if Israelis live under constant violence, Jews would not want to live in Israel, and they will leave Israel. There is even this strange proposition that I heard yesterday from somebody who's not a supporter of Palestinian terrorism, that if the Israelis don't have hope for peace, they will leave Israel. I don't think this is serious. We have learned to live without peace. Now, peace would be very nice. My grandmother, a great strategist in her own right, used to say that it's better to be young, healthy, and rich than sick, old, and poor. So if we also had peace, it would have been lovely. But the perception is that if the Israelis will be under constant threat of violence and exposed here and there for violence, they will finally leave. Now, it didn't work so far, but the hope is still very, very deeply entrenched. You can hear throughout the Arab world, particularly in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank and throughout the Arab world, we Arabs will win because we love death. You Jews will lose because you love life. And this notion is there, not very much under the surface. And it surfaces from time to time, last time about 12 years ago in a very, very major way. The second assumption is, and this relates particularly to Europe, that if a lot of violence is used again in the Middle East by radical forces, the Europeans will always come there to appease. Oh, now appeasement has different names. It's called engagement or dialogue, but I'm speaking about appeasement. And the idea is that if somebody is very violent, instead of saying, oh, that's bad, he's violent, you say, oh, what terrible injustice must have been inflicted on this person that made him so violent. For instance, we assume that after the Munich Olympics, people will be very much against the Palestinians here because the PLO, Yasser Arafat personally was involved in it, used violence in the Munich Olympics. But as we see, what we've had in Europe, this understanding of the Palestinians was very strongly pushed since the Palestinians demonstrated their ability to use a lot of violence. So again, the assumption is if you do it over a long period of time, and that's a history of 80 years, not only in terms of what they do, but also how they explain what they're doing. Now, is it all the Palestinians? No. Do you have Palestinians that are against it? Yes. But is it enough if a small part or a larger minority among the Palestinians do it and the others just condone it? The reality from an Israeli point of view is there regardless. And if you look at this region, you will find that this is a very violent region, the Arab world. And I'm speaking not only about Palestinians among themselves, because then you always have the excuse, oh, it's the occupation. Look at Algeria, look at the Yemen, look at places where you can't blame Israel or you can't blame the West. Again, you find an extremely high level of violence. So to assume that Israel will suffer from this violence is something that you must take very seriously, particularly because we've had a history, so long a history, where this was demonstrated. I'm afraid what we call the Arab Spring is not making these things easier, but much more difficult, because the more you listen to your own people, the more radical you get. I know that in Western experience, when you reflect the will of the people, you become a democracy. Remember, the one place in the Arab world where you had free elections and the government reflects the will of the people is Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So the assumption that if the people want something, it must be benign is something that we have to question. Last but not least, the reason we have little violence today from the West Bank comes primarily, I would say 95%, from deterrence, because the Palestinians have learned in the years 2002, 2005, that Israel can use very, very effective means. I mean, we crushed Palestinian terrorism exclusively by force, not by promises, but by the operation we call Defensive Shield, and later in the Gaza Strip by Operation Cast Lead. And deterrence works, And so far it works very well. But again, from historical experience, two things. A, deterrence tends to lose its effect over time. And you get deterrence, and after a while you have to get deterrence again because people forget. And the second thing is, Palestinians today harbor hopes that what will make Israel incapable of dealing with violence is Goldstone. If you ask me who is the greatest promoter of violence in the region, it is Goldstone. Because if you say that when major violence is perpetrated against your civilian population, and you respond, and we've just heard the numbers here, I found this lecture very, very interesting from Colonel Kemp about the proportions of how Israel compared to the best of civilized nations responds. And if you respond, you will be called a war criminal, then why not do it? Because A, we can damage Israel, and B, in responding, Israel will damage itself more than it will damage us. So the reaction to the flotilla, the reaction particularly of Goldstone to cast lead and other Israeli operations gives a lot of hope to the most radical elements in the Arab world. Now, does it mean that we are destined to lose the war against this kind of challenge? No. But does it mean we will have it for a very, very, very long time to come? And even if you reach an agreement with one kind of Palestinians, you will have another kind that will perpetrate violence on a large scale, and therefore you must constantly take it into account. Yes, you reach an agreement with the PLO, then the Hamas do it. You reach it with the Hamas, then the Islamic Jihad. And if you reach with Islamic Jihad, it's the popular this or the popular that. And when all you need is to fire a few rockets into the center of Israeli cities in order to disrupt life there, then anybody who doesn't take this danger very, very seriously is irresponsible. And if you don't take, and this is my last comment, if you don't take very serious measures to prevent it, then to respond to it, you will have to take much more stern measures than if you would have had a stitch in time. Thank you.
Professor, all right. Thank you for what I perhaps should describe as a very tough, starkly realistic or realist presentation of the concerns and fears, and I think fear is the right word, in Israel around the issues that we're discussing now. A couple of very brief comments there. I think the word encouraged in the question was a rather subtle use in the English language of encourage. I slightly noticed it myself. And secondly, I can't help remarking that Judge Goldstone doesn't have many fans on this panel.